Welcome, Junior Tukkies. I am Ms. Kutsia, and I'm here today to teach you about the scientific method. Since the beginning of time, humans have been asking how and why things happen in the world. So they constructed the scientific method, because the scientific method provides scientists with a well-structured scientific platform to help them find answers to these questions. So let's have a look at how the scientific method can be summarized. So firstly, we will start with the observation. We will move over to our investigative question, our hypothesis, which is a prediction of what would happen or what we think the answer should be. Then we will move over to the experiment. This includes the materials and the method of my experiment. Analysis will refer to the results of my experiment. And then lastly, we have our conclusion. So let's see what we must do at each of these sections, or what exactly is expected from us. So let's start with my observation, or also known as my aim. So your aim or your observation describes or identifies a problem. When writing your observation or your aim, it has to be in a specific format. So you will start with the following. You will write to test, to determine, to find out, or to observe. So for me to show you how these work, let's look at an example. So a farmer noticed that his tomato plants that are shaded have smaller tomatoes than plants that are in a sunny spot. So how you can construct this is you can choose any of the given formats and just connect it with your example. So for example, you can say to test if the amount of sunlight affects the size of the tomato, to determine if the amount of sunlight affects the size of the tomatoes, or to find out or to observe if the amount of sunlight will affect the size of the tomatoes. So when constructing your observation or your aim, make sure that you choose the one that fits best. Now we will move over to our investigative question. So this is the question which starts your investigation. So your investigation question is based on what you observe. So what I do usually when I construct my investigative question, I will take my aim or observation and I will turn it directly into a question. So just like my observation and my aim, there's a specific format to my investigative question. So firstly, it must be a question and end with a question mark. And then also it must start with one of the following. You can use how, what, when, who, which, why, and where. So let's move back to my example. Again with the size of the tomatoes. And I have to change my observation into a question. So let's have a look. Again, you can use any of the given formats that was allocated. So I would use, for example, how will the amount of sunlight affect the size of the tomatoes? Or will sunlight have an effect on the size of the tomatoes? Or even why will sunlight affect the size of the tomatoes? So again, formulate your question so that it sounds correctly, so that it fits perfectly to your observation. Now the next section, we are going to look at the hypothesis. So your hypothesis is a prediction or a statement you make, which is based on what you think will be the outcome of your investigation. So again, there's a specific format to it. So your hypothesis should be specific. It should relate directly to your investigative question. It must be written in future tense. And then you must mention the cause, so what you will do in this experiment, and the effect, so what will happen due to the changes which you make in this experiment. So let's have a look at our example. So in this statement, we can then state more sunlight will result in larger tomatoes, or you can even state and say that less sunlight will mean that I have smaller tomatoes. So there's no right and wrong answer here, but it has to be linked to the experiment that's being done. So my apparatus are all the materials that is needed for my experiment. This must include the following. It must include the size of the beakers, test tubes, or even measuring cylinders which will be used. It must include the quantities of chemicals or other substances. And then lastly, it must be written in the form of a list, just to make it easier to understand. Let's move over to the method, which is one of the most important sections that forms part of the scientific method, because this ensures that you accurately test your hypothesis. So your scientific method shows step by step how you have to do this experiment. The reason why this is so important is that other researchers may want to repeat your method to either verify your results or even improve on your results. And again, it's very important that your method is written in the following format. It must be written in the past tense because this experiment has already been done. It must be clear and precise, and most importantly, it must be in the correct sequence. So the next one is my analysis. So my analysis is stating your results in words. So there are 3 variables in the analysis which we need to identify. So firstly, we have the independent variable. So this variable, you as the researcher or the scientist can change, or you can choose the variable. Then secondly, we have the dependent variable. So this is the variable that we are measuring in my experiment. And lastly, we have the fixed or the constant variable. This variable does not change throughout my experiment. So again, let's have a look at my example to identify my variables. So your independent variable will refer to the amount of sunlight. So will the tomatoes be exposed to sunlight or to the shade? Your dependent variable will be the size of the tomatoes, which will be measured in centimeters. And then an example for your fixed or constant variable, the amount of water that's given to each tomato plant. And then lastly, the time or the day when you measure the size of the tomatoes. Then the results. So your results are observations which are made, which you then record in the form of a table or a graph, which I will go into detail in another video. So note, and it's very important to note this, that even if your results are not what you expected, it's still results and you can still make use of it. So I quickly drew a table where it indicates that I chose to measure the size of the tomatoes once a week, which is my independent variable. Then I have the size of my tomatoes, which is my dependent variable, and then I measured the sizes in the sun and also in the shade. So if I have a look at the tomatoes in the sun, we started with 2 centimeters, it moved up to 5 and then to 8. So I can see that my tomato is increasing in size with quite a large amount. But if I look at the shaded tomatoes, it started with 1 centimeters, moved up to 2 and then to 4. So my tomatoes in the shade is much, much smaller. Lastly, we get to our conclusion. So your conclusion is where you will link your aim and your hypothesis with your results. So let's have a look at how will my conclusion look for the example which we used. So firstly, you will state that your hypothesis was supported or not supported. And then you will state, after 3 weeks, it was clear that the tomato plants exposed to sunlight will grow larger than the tomatoes that was found in the shade. And that is it for today. Make sure to watch my next video on how to apply or use the scientific method with a specific experiment. I will put on 2 videos, one referring to photosynthesis, where we test for the presence of starch, and then secondly for cell respiration, where we test if carbon dioxide is produced as a product during cell respiration.